It was a bright summer morning on June 28th, 1914. The sun hung lazily over the narrow streets of Sarajevo. Cafe tables were crowded. Vendors shouted. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. It felt like any other Sunday in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And yet, within minutes, the world would begin to unravel. An open-top car turned onto Appel Quay. Inside sat a young royal couple, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie. He wore a plumed hat and a stiff military uniform. She wore white gloves. He had been warned. There were rumors of unrest. Serbian nationalists whispering in the shadows. Secret societies, bomb plots. The empire was uneasy, stretched across languages, religions, and simmering resentment. Earlier that morning, a bomb had already been thrown at the Archduke's motorcade. It exploded behind him, injuring bystanders but missing its target. The assassin swallowed poison and jumped into a river, only to be captured. The Archduke insisted on continuing his visit. Was it arrogance, duty, or simply a tragic underestimation of fate? The driver made a wrong turn. A 19-year-old man named Gavrilo Princip stood outside a sandwich shop. He could not believe his luck. The car stalled just feet away from him. 2 gunshots cracked through the air. Sophie slumped first. Then Franz Ferdinand. "I am not dying," he reportedly whispered. "It is nothing." But within minutes, they were both dead. Crowds gathered in confusion. Police scrambled. No one yet understood that these 2 bullets would soon echo across continents. Because this was not simply an assassination. It was a spark in a room filled with gunpowder, and within weeks Europe would burn. But why? How could the death of one archduke drag millions into a catastrophe no one truly wanted? To answer that, we must step back into a world trembling long before the shots were fired, and into an age where pride, fear, and ambition quietly sharpened their knives. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe believed itself civilized. Cities glittered with electric lights. Trains crisscrossed borders. Telegraph wires hummed with progress. The arts flourished in Vienna, Paris, and Berlin. Empires ruled vast territories overseas. Industry boomed. This era was called the Belle Époque, the Beautiful Age. But beneath the elegance lay tension. For decades, Europe had been building alliances like a fragile web. The idea was simple: balance power, prevent war. Instead, they created a trap. On one side stood the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain, bound by shared fears of German expansion. On the other stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The system was meant to deter aggression. But what if one nation moved? Would all the others follow? Like dominoes waiting for a single touch. Germany, newly unified in 1871, was powerful and ambitious. Its factories outpaced Britain's. Its army was disciplined and enormous. Its navy expanded rapidly, challenging British dominance of the seas. Britain felt threatened. France still burned with humiliation from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. It longed to reclaim lost territory, Alsace and Lorraine. Russia, vast and unstable, saw itself as protector of Slavic peoples in the Balkans. And Austria-Hungary? It was an aging empire holding together dozens of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Serbs. Nationalism was rising. Minorities wanted independence, especially in the Balkans. The region was nicknamed the Powder Keg of Europe. Serbia dreamed of uniting all South Slavs into one nation. That dream threatened Austria-Hungary directly, and Russia supported Serbia. So when Franz Ferdinand was killed by a Serbian nationalist, Vienna did not see an isolated act of violence. It saw rebellion. Berlin saw opportunity. St. Petersburg saw obligation. Paris saw alliance. London saw danger. But here is the haunting question. Did any of them truly want war? Or did they simply believe it would be short, glorious, and worth the risk? Because across Europe, young men marched in parades. Newspapers printed patriotic headlines. Crowds cheered mobilization orders. War, they believed, would be over by Christmas. They had no idea. In the weeks after the assassination, diplomacy did not move toward peace. It moved toward confrontation. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, harsh, humiliating demands designed to be rejected. Serbia agreed to most of them, but not all. That was enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began mobilizing to defend its Slavic ally. Germany issued warnings: stop or face consequences. Russia did not stop. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, bound by alliance, prepared for conflict. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. But there was one obstacle. France's eastern border was heavily fortified. Germany had a plan, the Schlieffen Plan, a bold strategy to avoid fighting on two fronts at once. It called for a swift invasion of France through neutral Belgium, knocking France out quickly before turning east against Russia. It was precise, timed, calculated, but it required violating Belgian neutrality. And Britain had sworn to defend Belgium. When German troops crossed the border on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In just over a month, a regional assassination had ignited a continental inferno. Crowds cheered as soldiers boarded trains. Women waved handkerchiefs, bands played. They believed they were marching toward glory. They were marching into mud, into trenches, into a new kind of warfare the world had never seen. And as armies moved with confidence across borders, none could yet imagine that the coming months would transform Europe into a graveyard. But the true horror would not be swift. It would settle in. The German army moved quickly through Belgium. Villages burned, civilians fled. Rumors of atrocities spread, fueling Allied propaganda. The French launched Plan 17, an aggressive offensive into Alsace-Lorraine. Soldiers wore bright blue coats and red trousers, marching proudly into machine gun fire. Within weeks, tens of thousands were dead. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies advanced into East Prussia only to be crushed at the Battle of Tannenberg. German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff emerged as heroes. The war was already larger than expected. Then came the First Battle of the Marne. In September 1914, German forces approached Paris. The city prepared for siege. Government officials fled. Taxis were famously used to rush French troops to the front. At the Marne River, French and British forces launched a desperate counterattack. The German advance faltered. The Schlieffen Plan failed. Germany could not knock France out quickly. The war would not be short. Both sides began digging trenches, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. They believed it was temporary. It would last 4 years. The Western Front became a scar across Europe. Life in the trenches was misery. Mud swallowed boots. Rats feasted on corpses. Shellfire was constant. Soldiers lived inches from death. Letters home spoke of boredom and terror in equal measure. Young men who had dreamed of medals now prayed simply to survive another night. And still, leaders insisted victory was near. But what kind of victory demands so much blood? As winter descended in 1914, something extraordinary happened. On Christmas Eve in parts of the Western Front, soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They sang carols. They exchanged cigarettes. They played football in no man's land. For a brief, fragile moment, enemies became human again. High command was furious. Fraternization was forbidden. Because if soldiers saw each other as men, how could they continue killing? The war had begun with cheers. It ended its first year with exhaustion, and this was only the beginning. By 1915, the illusion of quick victory had evaporated. The front lines barely moved. Commanders sought new ways to break the stalemate. They found them in science. In April 1915, near Ypres, German forces released chlorine gas into Allied trenches. A green cloud drifted silently across the battlefield. Soldiers coughed, clutched their throats, collapsed in agony. It was a new horror. Soon both sides used chemical weapons, mustard gas, phosgene. Masks became standard equipment. Fear of invisible death hung in the air. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, expanding the war into the Middle East. British forces launched the Gallipoli campaign, hoping to knock the Ottomans out and open a route to Russia. It was a disaster. Thousands died on narrow beaches and rugged cliffs. Among the Ottoman defenders was a young officer named Mustafa Kemal. His leadership would echo decades later. In the skies, airplanes appeared, first for reconnaissance, then combat. A new dimension of warfare was born. At sea, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. In May 1915, a British passenger ship, the Lusitania, was torpedoed by a German submarine. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The United States was outraged, but not yet ready for war. President Woodrow Wilson insisted on neutrality. Yet beneath the surface, American industry supplied the Allies. Loans flowed to Britain and France. The war was becoming global, and at home, civilians felt its weight. Food shortages, inflation, propaganda posters urging sacrifice, factories filled with women replacing men at the front. Entire societies were reorganized for total war. This was no longer a conflict of armies alone. It was a war of nations, and it was devouring a generation. Still, leaders believed one great offensive might end it. They were wrong, because 1916 would bring a level of slaughter the world had never witnessed, and Europe would stand on the edge of breaking. By 1916, the war had settled into a grim rhythm. Artillery thundered day and night. Trenches stretched like open wounds across the earth. Generals studied maps in distant chateaux while soldiers drowned in mud. But in February 1916, the rhythm changed. Germany launched a massive assault on a French fortress town, Verdun. The plan devised by General Erich von Falkenhayn was chilling in its logic. He did not necessarily intend to capture Verdun. He intended to bleed France dry. To bleed France white, he allegedly said. Verdun was symbolic. French pride, a gateway to Paris. They could not abandon it, so they defended it at any cost. For 10 months, the two sides hurled shells at each other in numbers never seen before. Forests vanished. Hills were flattened. The ground itself became toxic. Men lived under constant bombardment. Entire units were erased in minutes. The phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became France's cry of defiance. Over 300 days, more than 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, and the lines barely moved. But if Verdun was Germany's attempt to destroy French morale, the Somme was Britain's answer. On July 1st, 1916, after a week of artillery bombardment, British troops climbed out of their trenches along the River Somme. They believed the bombardment had destroyed German defenses. It had not. Machine guns cut them down in waves. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were casualties, the bloodiest single day in British military history. And still, the offensive continued for months. The Somme became a grinding battle of attrition. New weapons appeared, most notably the tank. Primitive, unreliable, but terrifying. It changed nothing immediately. By the end of 1916, over 1 million men had fallen at Verdun and the Somme combined. A generation was vanishing, and for what? Front lines shifted by mere miles. But something else was shifting too. Faith in leadership. Letters home grew darker. Soldiers spoke of disillusionment. Some whispered that the generals had lost touch with reality. Yet the war machine rolled on, because none of the great powers could admit defeat. And while Europe bled, another empire was beginning to crack from within. In the east, Russia was exhausted. Years of defeat had crippled its army. Food shortages plagued cities. The economy faltered. Confidence in Tsar Nicholas II evaporated. In March 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd. Women marched for bread. Workers joined them. Soldiers refused orders to suppress crowds. The Tsar abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule collapsed in days. A provisional government promised reform, but chose to continue the war. That decision proved fatal, because within months another revolution brewed. A radical faction led by Vladimir Lenin promised peace, land, and bread. They argued the war was an imperialist disaster. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Russia began negotiating an exit. For Germany, this was a breakthrough. If Russia left the war, German troops could move west. But 1917 brought another dramatic shift. Across the Atlantic, Germany, desperate to break Britain's blockade, resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats targeted ships without warning. American vessels were sunk. Then came a secret telegram. The Zimmermann telegram, sent by Germany to Mexico, proposed an alliance if the United States entered the war, promising to help Mexico reclaim lost territories. British intelligence intercepted and revealed it. American public opinion shifted sharply. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson framed it as a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy. But American troops would take time to arrive. In the meantime, Europe staggered on. On the Western Front, French soldiers, exhausted by failed offensives, mutinied. They refused suicidal attacks. Some sang the Internationale. Others simply stayed in their trenches. The French High Command quietly restored discipline, combining punishment with reforms. The British launched another massive offensive at Passchendaele. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in shell holes filled with mud. Photographs from Passchendaele look like another planet. Trees reduced to splinters, landscapes erased. The war felt endless. Empires were falling, societies were fraying. And yet, one final gamble remained. Because in 1918, Germany would make its last desperate move, and the world would tilt toward its climax. With Russia out of the war, Germany shifted divisions west. Time was critical. American troops were arriving in growing numbers. If Germany could defeat the Allies before U.S. strength fully mobilized, victory might still be possible. In March 1918, Germany launched the Spring Offensive. It was swift, coordinated, and brutal. Stormtrooper units bypassed strongpoints, infiltrating deep into Allied lines. Artillery barrages were precise and devastating. For a moment, it seemed as though the war might finally break open. German forces advanced farther than they had since 1914. Paris once again prepared for evacuation. Shells fell on the city. Allied commanders panicked. Then something unprecedented happened. The Allies unified command under French General Ferdinand Foch. Coordination improved. American troops, fresh, determined, entered combat in large numbers. At Below Wood, U.S. Marines fought fiercely against German forces. Casualties were severe, but the line held. The German offensive slowed. Supplies ran thin. Soldiers were exhausted. Many had marched for days without adequate food. And then the Allies counterattacked. Beginning in August 1918, a series of offensives, later called the 100 Days, pushed German forces back. The tide had turned. German morale collapsed. Desertions increased. The home front was starving under blockade. Workers struck in factories. In November, sailors in the German fleet mutinied rather than launch a final suicidal attack. Revolution spread. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed. After 4 years, over 16 million dead, and entire regions reduced to rubble, the war ended. Church bells rang. Crowds celebrated. But peace did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. And beneath the relief lay a deeper question. What had it all been for? Because the war had ended on the battlefield, but its consequences were only beginning. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe exhaled. But silence is not the same as peace. In January 1919, delegates from around the world gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the same hall where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871 after France's defeat. History, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The men who dominated the negotiations became known as the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each arrived with different goals. Wilson envisioned a new world order built on self-determination and collective security. His 14 points promised fairness, transparency, and the creation of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars. Clemenceau, whose country had been ravaged twice by Germany in half a century, wanted security above all. He demanded reparations, territorial adjustments, and a weakened Germany that could never threaten France again. Lloyd George balanced between punishment and practicality. Britain wanted to protect its empire and maintain naval dominance, but also avoid completely crippling Germany's economy. Orlando sought territorial gains promised to Italy. They spoke of justice, but justice is often shaped by fear. Germany was not invited to negotiate the terms. It was summoned in May and handed a treaty. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory, limited its military to 100,000 men, forbade tanks and aircraft, and imposed massive reparations. Most humiliating of all was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, declaring Germany solely responsible for the war. To many Germans, this felt like betrayal. They had not been invaded deeply. Their army had not been decisively crushed on home soil. Politicians in Berlin signed the armistice, not generals at the front. A myth began to form, the stab in the back. That Germany had not truly been defeated militarily, but betrayed by civilians, socialists, and Jews. It was a dangerous narrative. Meanwhile, empires disintegrated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fractured into new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, its territories divided by European powers. In the Middle East, arbitrary borders were drawn, planting seeds of future conflict. Russia had already transformed into a revolutionary state, the Soviet Union. The map of Europe was redrawn, but self-determination was selective. Millions found themselves minorities in new nations. Ethnic tensions simmered. The League of Nations was formed, Wilson's dream of collective security. But the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. America never joined. The League began its life weakened. In the jubilant photographs from Versailles, leaders smile stiffly. Diplomats pose. Yet behind those smiles lingered resentment, humiliation, and unresolved anger. The war had ended. But had the peace been built on sand? When the soldiers returned home, they did not return to the world they had left. In France and Britain, memorials rose in nearly every village, names carved into stone: sons, brothers, fathers. In Germany, inflation spiraled in the early 1920s. Savings evaporated. Political extremism grew louder. In Italy, veterans felt cheated by the peace settlement. A sense of national humiliation spread. Across Europe, economies struggled to transition from war production to peacetime stability. Strikes erupted, ideologies hardened. And then there were the invisible wounds. Men who had survived the trenches suffered what was then called shell shock. Nightmares, tremors, silence. An entire generation had been exposed to industrialized slaughter. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque would later capture the emptiness felt by those who survived. The war had destroyed the old world. Monarchies, aristocratic certainty, faith in endless progress. Before 1914, Europe believed war was a noble contest. After 1918, it understood mechanized annihilation. But here is the cruel paradox. The First World War was meant to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the prelude. In Germany, resentment festered. In 1933, a radical nationalist named Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising to overturn Versailles. In the Soviet Union, revolutionary ideology hardened under Joseph Stalin. In Italy, Benito Mussolini established fascism. The unresolved tensions of 1919 slowly reignited. 2 decades after the armistice, the world would once again plunge into global war. And this time, it would be even more devastating. World War I reshaped borders, governments, and societies. It accelerated the decline of European dominance and paved the way for the United States and the Soviet Union to emerge as superpowers. It redrew the Middle East in ways still contested today. It transformed warfare, introducing tanks, submarines, aerial combat, and chemical weapons. It altered the role of women in society as millions entered the workforce. It shattered faith in old institutions and gave rise to modernism in art and literature, a reflection of fractured reality. But perhaps its deepest impact was psychological. Before 1914, many believed civilization was marching inevitably toward progress. After 1918, that belief was harder to sustain. The First World War taught humanity that technological advancement does not guarantee moral advancement. It showed how alliances meant to preserve peace can entangle nations in catastrophe. It demonstrated how pride, fear, and miscalculation can spiral beyond control. And it leaves us with an unsettling question. If a single assassination in Sarajevo could ignite a global conflict that claimed millions of lives, what unseen tensions exist in our own time? What alliances bind us? What resentments simmer beneath diplomacy? History does not repeat itself in identical form, but it rhymes. The trenches of the Western Front have long since grown quiet. Grass covers the scars. Forests have returned where artillery once roared. Yet beneath that soil lie fragments of shells, rusted helmets, and bones, silent reminders of how fragile peace truly is. The men who marched in 1914 believed they were entering a short, glorious adventure. They stepped instead into a tragedy that would define the 20th century. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the First World War is this: civilization is not destroyed in a single moment of madness. It unravels slowly, through pride, through fear, through choices made by men who believe they control events. Until one morning, the sun rises over a quiet city. A driver takes a wrong turn, and history changes forever.